I was gone for 3 years, taking care of the only family I had left, and when I came home, my ranch had a guard gate, a valet stand, and a bunch of men in polo shirts swinging golf clubs where my horses used to graze. The sign out front said Red Mesa Links and Country Club, which would have been real impressive if it had not been nailed into my soil. And the funniest part, if you can call any of this funny, was that everybody there looked at me like I was the trespasser. My name is Eli Warren. I am 51 years old, born and raised in the flat, wind-slapped stretch of western Nebraska where people measure distance by fence posts and weather by how much it hurts your knees in the morning. My family had been on that land since my great-grandfather came west with a busted wagon axle, $37 in his pocket, and the kind of stubbornness that either builds a life or ruins one, depending on the day. We called it Hollow Creek Ranch, even though the creek had been dry more years than it had been wet, and it was not a big glamorous spread like you see in those ranching magazines where everybody has clean boots and perfect sunsets. It was 62 acres of hard dirt, pasture grass, old cottonwoods, and a barn that leaned a little more every winter, but somehow never gave up. My father used to say that barn had more backbone than half the men in town, and when I was younger, I thought he was just being dramatic. But the older I got, the more I understood he was talking about all of us. My life before everything went sideways was quiet in the way I liked it. Up before the sun, coffee strong enough to make a spoon stand up, checking water tanks, patching wire, listening to the radio crackle with farm reports, and minding my own business with the kind of dedication most people reserve for religion. I was never rich, not even close, but I was steady, and there is a dignity in steady that you do not appreciate until somebody tries to take it from you. My mother passed when I was 28. My father held on another 20 years after that, and when he died in the fall of 2020, he left me the ranch. A rusty Winchester he swore was worth more than it was, and one sentence I could not shake. He said, "Son, land is the only thing that remembers you after everybody else forgets." That stuck with me, probably because he said it 3 days before he died, sitting on the back porch with a blanket over his legs, watching the west pasture like he was trying to memorize it before he left. So, when the deed came to me, I did not see money. I did not see opportunity. I saw responsibility, the kind that sits on your shoulders quietly and gets heavier when nobody is looking. Then came the call about my Aunt Ruth in Idaho. She was my mother's oldest sister, the woman who mailed me birthday cards with $5 bills inside until I was 40, the woman who could make peach cobbler out of canned fruit and somehow make it taste like Sunday morning. She had no kids, no husband left. And when Parkinson's and early dementia started taking pieces of her, there was nobody else to step in. At first, I told myself I would go for a month, maybe 2, get us settled, figure out care, come home before calving season turned ugly. But life has a nasty habit of laughing at your calendar. 1 month became 6, 6 became a year, and before I knew it, I had a little routine up there, driving her to appointments, labeling cabinets so she could find things, sitting through evenings where she remembered my mother, like she had seen her yesterday, but could not remember whether I was Eli or my dad. That kind of thing changes a man in small, mean ways. It wears you down slow. Back home, I left the ranch in the hands of a man named Marco Alvarez, who had worked for my father and then for me, and if there was ever a man I trusted with a gate key, it was Marco. He knew which fence line always sagged after a hard freeze, knew which mare kicked if you came up on her blind side, knew my father's old tractor needed to be sweet-talked before it would start. We talked every couple of weeks. He would say, "Place is still standing, Eli," like always, and I would laugh and tell him that was all I needed to hear. I kept the taxes paid, insurance current, mail forwarded, county notices checked, everything clean and boring. Because boring paperwork is beautiful paperwork when you own land. I never got a warning letter. Never got a tax delinquency notice, never got a call from the county clerk. Nothing that would make a reasonable person think his ranch was being carved up behind his back. And maybe that is what still eats at me. The quietness of it, how something so loud could happen so silently. Aunt Ruth passed in April of 2024, sitting in her recliner with an old game show playing low on the TV and the half-finished cup of tea beside her. She went gently, which I was grateful for. But grief is strange. It does not always arrive as crime. Sometimes it shows up as exhaustion so deep you forget what your own voice sounds like. After the funeral, I packed what little I had taken with me, loaded my truck, and drove south with the windows down, thinking about home the way a thirsty man thinks about water. I pictured the ranch exactly as I had left it, the gate with the bent top rail, the dirt drive with 2 ruts worn deep from generations of tires, the barn roof with that one sheet of tin that rattled in high wind, the pasture opening up like an old friend. About 10 miles out, I started feeling something loosen in my chest. I remember even smiling when I passed the old grain elevator outside Miller's Crossing, because that meant I was close. Then I turned onto County Road 18, came over the low-rise, and my hands tightened on the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white. The dirt drive was gone. In its place was a smooth black asphalt entrance lined with limestone blocks and little decorative grasses that had no business surviving in Nebraska wind. There was a black iron gate where my cattle guard used to be, cameras mounted on posts, a keypad, and beyond it, a green fairway so perfect it looked fake, rolling across the same pasture where I had once pulled a calf out of a spring mudhole at 2 in the morning while cussing loud enough to wake God. I sat there with my truck idling, blinking like an idiot, because your brain does not accept betrayal all at once. It tries to file it under mistake first. Wrong road, wrong gate, wrong property, anything but the truth. I backed up, checked the mailbox post, checked the bend in the road, checked the 3 cottonwoods on the north line, and there they were, older and uglier than ever, standing right where they had always stood. This was Hollow Creek. This was mine. I got out of the truck and walked to the gate, slow, because some part of me thought maybe if I moved too fast the world would crack open. There was a bronze plaque set into the stone pillar that read Red Mesa Links and Country Club, members only, and underneath it, in smaller letters, developed by Plains Edge Holdings, I actually laughed when I read it, just one dry little laugh, the kind that comes out when your mind is trying not to scream. A golf cart rolled by on the other side of the gate with 2 older men in pastel shirts, one of them lifting a hand at me like I was a delivery driver blocking the entrance. That was when a woman's voice came through the speaker box, crisp as a hotel manager, asking if I needed assistance. I leaned toward the little metal grill and said, "Yeah, I believe I do, because you folks built a golf course on my ranch." There was a pause, not long, but long enough for her to decide what kind of problem I was. "Sir," she said, "this is private property." I said, "Lady, that is the first true thing anybody has said today. My name is Eli Warren, and I own it." Another pause, cooler this time. Then she said the sentence that made the blood drain out of my face. "Mr. Warren, according to our records, this land was purchased legally in 2022, and the transfer documents were signed by you personally." I stood there in the wind, staring through that gate at rich men laughing on my dead father's pasture, and for a second I could not feel my hands. Then I said, real quiet, "No, ma'am, they were not." And that was the moment I understood I had not come home to a mistake. I had come home to a crime. I did not remember walking back to my truck, not clearly anyway. I remember the sound of gravel under my boots, even though there was hardly any gravel left, just that pretty asphalt they had poured over my life like a fresh coat of lice. I sat behind the wheel with the door open, one boot still on the ground, and I kept looking through that gate at the fairway, the white flags, the carts drifting around like nothing in the world was wrong. A man in a visor bent down to line up a putt, right about where my father had once buried our old sheepdog, Cooper, under a cottonwood because he said good dogs deserve shade. I wanted to drive straight through that gate. I really did. Just put the truck in gear and let Detroit Steel explain property law in a language everybody understood. But my father had also taught me that anger is a fine horse and a terrible driver. So I took one breath, then another, and called Marco. He answered quick, like he had been sitting near the phone. "Ely," he said, "you back home yet?" I looked at the gate and said, "I'm standing in front of something called Red Mesa Links, so you tell me." The silence on his end did not surprise me as much as it should have. It was not the silence of a man hearing bad news. It was the silence of the man hearing bad news finally arrive. "Marco," I said, real slow, "why is there a country club on Hollow Creek Ranch?" He breathed out through his nose, and when he spoke, his voice had gone smaller. "I tried calling you more than once." "Ellie." "No," I said. "You called me every 2 weeks and told me the place was standing. You did not mention golf carts." He said, "County people came first. then surveyors, then lawyers with papers. They said you had sold the East and South pasture to Plains Edge Holdings and leased them access through the old drive. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. I sold it. That is what they said. They had your signature, your driver license copy, notarized sale agreement, everything. I asked him if he had seen me sign anything, if he had spoken to me about selling the land, if he had ever, in all the years he knew me, heard me breathe one word about turning Hollow Creek into a playground for men who iron their shorts. He did not answer right away. Then he said, no, and there it was. The answer under the answer. Marco had not betrayed me exactly, not in the clean movie villain kind of way, but he had chosen the comfort of official-looking paper over the discomfort of calling a friend and saying something is wrong. That hurt more than I wanted to admit. I asked him who brought the papers. He said a man named Brent Carver, local real estate attorney, worked with developers, wore shiny boots, smiled too much. That name meant something to me, because Brent had tried buying land around Hollow Creek for years, small parcels mostly, always talking about growth and opportunity, like those words were supposed to make people forget they were being pressured. My father could not stand him. Dad used to say, Brent had a handshake like warm fish and a soul to match. I hung up at Marco before I said something I could not take back, then drove into Miller's Crossing and parked outside the office of Lenora Price, the attorney my family had used since before I was born. Nora was 72, maybe 5'3" in her good shoes, with silver hair pinned tight and eyes sharp enough to cut baling wire. She had handled my father's estate, my mother's will, a fence dispute with our neighbor in 2006, and one unfortunate incident involving a bull, a church picnic, and a Methodist pastor's new Buick. When I walked in, she looked over her glasses and said, Ely Warren, you look like you swallowed a hornet. I told her, Nora, somebody stole my ranch. She did not smile. She did not ask if I was being dramatic. She just shut the office door and said, sit down. I told her everything. The gate, the woman on the speaker, Plains Edge Holdings, the claim that I signed documents in 2022. Nora listened without blinking, making notes in that square, old-fashioned handwriting of hers, and, when I finished, she leaned back and tapped her pen against her desk. There are two kinds of thieves, she said, the kind who come through a window and the kind who come through the county recorder's office. The second kind are usually more expensive. Within an hour, she had her clerk pulling title records, recorded deeds, tax maps, permits, easement filings, everything connected to Hollow Creek. I sat there while the printer spit out page after page, and each sheet felt like another shovel of dirt thrown onto my chest. According to the county, I had sold 41 acres of my 62-acre ranch to Plains Edge Holdings in August of 2022 for $875,000. According to the papers, I had appeared in person at a closing office in Kearney, produced identification, signed the sale agreement, granted temporary construction access, and agreed not to interfere with commercial development. According to the papers, I had done all that while sitting beside Aunt Ruth in Idaho after she fell in the bathroom and broke 2 ribs. I knew the date because I had spent that whole week sleeping in a vinyl hospital chair that squeaked every time I moved. Nora looked at the signature first. She did not say anything for maybe 10 seconds. Then she slid the page toward me and said, whoever signed this has never seen your handwriting. It was almost insulting. Honestly, my real signature is ugly. Always has been. All sharp angles and a long tail on the W, like a horse kicked the pen at the end. This one looked smooth, careful, practiced by somebody who thought neat meant believable. Then Nora checked the notary seal. Her eyebrows lifted, just a little, which for Nora was basically shouting. Notary commission number does not match the name, she said. Name belongs to a woman in Scottsbluff who retired in 2019. Seal format is wrong too. Then she flipped another page. Witness signature. Same problem. Address leads to a UPS store. Plains Edge Holdings was registered in Delaware, managed through another company in Wyoming, with a Nebraska mailing address that turned out to be a rented office nobody actually used. It was a paper maze, but not a perfect one. Greed never builds perfect mazes. It leaves doors open because it assumes nobody is coming. Nora asked where I was on the closing date. I pulled up my phone, hands shaking now. Not from fear, but from that strange, hot focus a man gets when the fog finally lifts. I had bank charges in Boise that morning, a pharmacy receipt, a gas station transaction, and a photo Aunt Ruth's nurse had texted me at 3:12 p.m., showing Ruth asleep with a purple blanket over her knees. Nora printed all of it, stapled it together, and said, "Abby, this is not a civil misunderstanding. This is forgery, fraud, identity theft, and likely wire fraud if money crossed state lines." I said, "Good." She looked at me over her glasses. "Good. Yes, but do not go cowboy on me." That was unfair, because I had only considered going cowboy 3 or 4 times by then, maybe 5. She filed emergency notices that afternoon, a cloud on the title, a fraud affidavit, and a demand letter to Plains Edge and Red Mesa's board. She also called the state attorney general's office and, because the transaction involved shell companies and interstate payments, she sent copies to a federal investigator she knew from an old banking fraud case. I thought that would be the slow part, government wheels turning like frozen tractor gears. But once money trails and forged identities get involved, people in quiet offices start paying attention real fast. That evening, I checked into the Wagon Wheel Motel because I could not exactly sleep in my own house. The old farmhouse was still standing, but Red Mesa had fenced it off inside what they now called maintenance grounds. Like my childhood bedroom was just another utility shed. Around 9 that night, my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered because by then my whole life had become an unknown number. A man said, "Mr. Warren, this is Graham Voss, counsel for Red Mesa Links. We received a rather aggressive letter from your attorney." I said, "Did you receive the part where you are on stolen land, or did the fax cut off early?" He cleared his throat. Smooth voice, expensive voice, the kind of voice that probably billed by the breath. "We believe this is a matter between you and Plains Edge Holdings. Red Mesa purchased development rights in good faith." I sat on the edge of that motel bed, looking at a painting of a duck that had seen better decades, and said, "Mr. Voss, boss, if you bought a stolen truck in good faith, it is still not your truck." He did not like that. "You should be careful about making accusations." I smiled then, not because I was happy, but because something in me had clicked into place. "No," I said, "you should be careful about parking golf carts on a crime scene." There was a long silence. Then he said, "What do you want?" I looked out the motel window toward the dark highway and thought about my father, about Aunt Ruth, about Cooper under that tree, about all those men laughing on grass they had no right to touch. I said, "I want every lock, code, gate, and account tied to my land handed over by noon Friday, and I want your members off my property until ownership is settled." He almost laughed. "That is not realistic." I said, "Neither was coming home to a golf course, but here we are." Then I hung up. The next morning, Nora called before sunrise and told me not to panic, which is a wonderful way to start a conversation if your goal is to make somebody panic immediately. She had heard back from the federal investigator, a man named Agent Cole Merritt, and he wanted to meet, not next month, not when convenient, that day. Nora drove with me because she said she did not trust me to keep my mouth civilized, and she was probably right. We met Agent Merritt in a plain brick building outside Lincoln. No dramatic interrogation room, no movie lighting, just a table, 3 chairs, and a government coffee machine that looked like it had been punishing people since 1984. Merritt was calm, clean-cut, mid-40s, with the tired eyes of a man who had read too many lies on official forms. He walked us through what they had already confirmed. The sale money had moved through 3 accounts in 2 states, before landing under the control of a man named Calvin Rusk, founder of Plains Edge Holdings. Calvin was not some shadowy genius. He was a failed developer with nice suits, bad debt, and a talent for finding desperate small towns willing to believe anything that sounded like economic growth. Red Mesa Links was supposed to be his comeback. Luxury golf, private memberships, vacation cottages later, maybe a hotel if he could charm a county board long enough. And Hollow Creek, my Hollow Creek, had been the cheap land he needed to make it work. And Merritt opened a folder and slid a still image across the table. It was security footage from the fake closing. A man stood at a counter wearing a denim jacket and a cap pulled low, signing papers with my name. I stared at that picture until my eyes burned. He had my approximate height, my general build, maybe enough resemblance if nobody cared to look too hard, which apparently nobody had. "Do you know him?" Merritt asked. I shook my head. Nora leaned closer, then whispered something I will never forget. "That is not a stranger." I looked at her. "What?" She tapped the image with one red fingernail. "That is Brent Carver's younger brother, Travis, And right then, the whole thing stopped being paperwork and became personal. I looked at that grainy picture until the man in it almost seemed to move, and all I could think was how cheap it looked. Not the crime itself, but the costume of it. The denim jacket, the cap, the lazy little attempt to become me for 20 minutes at a closing desk. Nora said his name again, Travis Carver. And Agent Merritt did not react much, but I saw his pen stop moving. Brent Carver had been sniffing around Hollow Creek for years, always saying the town needed progress, always acting like old ranchers were selfish for not handing over land so men like him could turn it into something profitable. Turns out he did not need to convince me. He just needed me gone long enough to replace me. Merritt asked Nora how sure she was, and she said, sure enough to say it in court and sleep fine after. That was when the investigation turned from quiet to hungry. Phone records came first, then bank subpoenas, then emails, and once those doors opened, Calvin Rusk and Brent Carver started looking less like businessmen and more like raccoons caught in a feed room. Brent had handled the fake closing through a side office not under his firm name. Travis had been paid $15,000 2 days later through a construction consulting invoice, and Calvin had used the forged deed to secure investors for Red Mesa before flipping development rights to the club board for nearly $4 million. Everybody had made money except the one man whose land was under their feet. 2 days after that meeting, I drove back to Hollow Creek with Nora riding beside me and a court order folded in a yellow envelope between us. Temporary injunction, emergency access restoration, no further development, no destruction of records, no exclusion of the rightful title holder. That last part felt pretty good, I will not lie. When we pulled up to the gate, there was a young security guard standing there with a radio clipped to his shoulder and the nervous posture of a kid who had been told to stop trouble without being told what trouble actually was. He said, "Sir, this is members only." Nora rolled down her window, handed him the order, and said, "Sweetheart, today everybody is a member of reality." He read about 4 lines, turned pale, and started making calls. 10 minutes later, Graham Voss came out of the clubhouse with Rebecca Slung, the club president, walking beside him. Rebecca was polished in that dangerous way. White blouse, perfect hair, calm face, the kind of woman who could tell you your house was on fire and make it sound like a scheduling issue. She looked at me and said, "Mr. Warren, we understand emotions are high." I said, "Rebecca, my emotions are doing just fine. It is your title insurance that should be sweating." Voss tried to step in, saying they needed time to review the order, but Nora cut him off so clean it was almost beautiful. "You can review it from the parking lot if you prefer. This property is not to operate as a private club until lawful access and ownership issues are resolved." Behind them, golfers had started gathering near the clubhouse windows, confused, annoyed. Holding drinks like this was some inconvenience arranged just to ruin their morning. And maybe that is when the bitterness hit me hardest, not at Calvin or Brent, but at the whole machine around them. All those people enjoying what had been taken because the grass was trimmed nice and the paperwork looked shiny. The next week was ugly. Red Mesa's board claimed they were innocent purchasers. Calvin claimed he relied on Brent. Brent claimed Travis acted alone. Travis claimed he thought he was signing promotional paperwork, which might have been more believable if he had not used my name, my forged license copy, and a fake notary seal. Lies are funny that way. They start out dressed nice. Then one sleeve comes loose, then a shoe falls off, and pretty soon the whole thing is standing naked in daylight. The arrest came on a Thursday morning. Calvin Rusk was picked up outside his office in Omaha, wearing a navy suit and the stunned expression of a man who had mistaken confidence for armor. Brent Carver was taken from the courthouse parking lot, which was about as poetic as Nebraska law enforcement gets, and Travis gave himself up later that afternoon after calling Nora to ask if I would consider not pressing charges. Nora told him I was not a vending machine where he could insert panic and receive mercy. By then the story had hit local news, and suddenly everybody in Miller's Crossing had an opinion. Some folks called me a hero. Some said Red Mesa had brought jobs and I should not punish the whole community. And a few brave idiots suggested maybe I had forgotten selling the land, which is a special kind of stupid you only hear from people who've never owned anything worth stealing. The final confrontation happened in the clubhouse conference room, a long glass box overlooking the 18th green, which sat right on my old south pasture. Rebecca, Voss, 3 board members, Nora, me, and a mediator who looked like he wished he had chosen dentistry. Rebecca opened with good faith. Community benefit. significant investment, all the polished phrases people use when they want the word stolen kept out of the room. I let her talk. I let her explain the irrigation systems, the jobs, the members, the events already booked. Then I leaned forward and said, "Rebecca, I understand you bought a dream. Problem is, you bought it from a thief, and he built it on my father's graveyard of memories." The room went quiet after that. Nora placed our terms on the table. Red Mesa could either shut down, restore the land at their expense, and face a damages lawsuit that would likely bury them, or they could lease the developed acreage from me under terms so tight a mosquito could not slip through. Annual rent paid monthly, back payment for unauthorized use, full legal fees, environmental restoration bond, public acknowledgement that I had never sold the ranch. One missed payment triggered immediate default and surrender of every improvement fixed to the land. Boss called it excessive. Nora smiled and said, "So was stealing a ranch." In the end, they signed. And they did not sign because they were sorry. They signed because math has a way of making proud people practical. Calvin pled guilty to wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. Brent lost his license before he ever saw sentencing. Travis took a deal and testified, which did not make him noble, just useful. As for me, I got Hollow Creek back, though not the way my father would have recognized it. Some mornings I still drive to that gate and watch the sprinklers sweep over grass that used to feed cattle. I see men laughing in golf carts, and underneath that, I see my dad at sunset, one hand on the fence, hat low, telling me land remembers. Maybe he was right. Maybe land remembers everything. The honest work, the quiet years, the theft, the fight, all of it. People ask why I did not make them tear it out. And some days I ask myself the same thing. But every month Red Mesa sends a check big enough to keep the rest of Hollow Creek protected for the next generation. And every check comes with my name on it, spelled correctly, signed by people who now know exactly who owns the ground beneath their feet. So yeah, I left home to care for family. Came back to find strangers had turned my ranch into their private playground, and somehow I ended up becoming their landlord. Maybe that is justice. Maybe it is compromise. Maybe it is just the strangest revenge a rancher ever got. But I want to know what you think. If somebody stole your family land and built something valuable on it, would you shut it down out of principle? Or take the money and make them pay for the rest of their lives? And do you think people like Calvin Rusk and Brent Carver are rare? Or are they everywhere, just waiting for the right gate to be left unlocked? Drop your answer in the comments, because I still go back and forth on it, and I have a feeling this one says a lot about what people think justice really means.